The gala dinner hall gleamed like a temple of ostentation. Crystal chandeliers illuminated tables laden with fine goblets and gilded plates. The women wore luxurious gowns. The men laughed loudly over glasses of expensive wine. In the corner, discreetly, the blonde waitress served the guests, trying not to attract attention. But all it took was a stumble, a small tray wobbling, for laughter to erupt. "Look, she even stumbles here," one of the guests mocked, and laughter soon spread through the room like wildfire. The young woman lowered her head, her face flushing, her eyes welling up. Everyone believed her humiliation would be just another diversion for the evening, but no one knew she was carrying something hidden, a secret that would transform that night into an unforgettable turning point. As the laughter echoed, one detail went unnoticed by many, but not all. The waitress, bending down to pick up a fallen napkin, revealed a golden pendant that glinted in the chandelier's light. An ancient symbol engraved on its surface caught the attention of one of the older guests. His eyes widened, nearly dropping his glass. He whispered to his wife beside him, This can't be—" The murmur began to spread through the tables, gradually drowning out the laughter. The laughter that had previously overwhelmed her now turned to whispers of disbelief. The waitress, still with her head bowed, didn't realize that her life was about to change before everyone's eyes, and that her secret, kept for years, was beginning to come to light. If you felt the power of this story in these first moments, imagine what's yet to come. Every detail holds a twist, every silence conceals a weight. Take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel, so you can journey together to the end of this narrative where destiny always reveals its face. The gala dinner was the most anticipated event of the year. High society guests paraded their luxurious attire down the mansion's marble staircase, while photographers captured every detail. The main dining room looked like something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden light, reflected in mirrors that doubled the splendor of the venue. The tables were covered with fine linens, decorated with floral arrangements, and crystal glasses glittered under the lighting. Each guest sought to be noticed, but also took pleasure in observing and judging the others. It was a parade of vanity, where there was no room for slip-ups. Among them, almost invisible, walked the young blonde maid. Her uniform contrasted with the guests' exuberant dresses, but even so, her natural beauty caught the eye of some. Still, she kept her head down, carefully holding a tray, aware that any false move would be punished with laughter and snide remarks. She moved between the tables, overhearing snippets of conversation about million-dollar deals, international travel, and newly acquired jewelry. It was as if she were in a world she would never belong to, or one everyone believed she wouldn't. And then, the inevitable happened. As she poured a glass of wine, one of the guests made a harsh comment, mocking her shy demeanor. His laughter was the trigger for others to follow suit. A napkin fell to the floor, and when she bent down to pick it up, the tray tilted slightly. It wasn't a disaster, but enough to make one of the women at the table let out a shrill laugh. "Look at that! Even carrying a tray is too much for her." Laughter spread quickly throughout the room, as if everyone was just waiting for an excuse to laugh at her. Some men raised their glasses mockingly, women whispered among themselves, and soon the maid became the unwelcome attraction of the evening. Her face flushed, and her eyes welled up. She gripped the tray tightly, trying to hide the trembling in her hands. Silently, she endured the onslaught of laughter, each laugh piercing like a knife. Meanwhile, at one of the central tables, the millionaire host watched the scene with a neutral expression. He didn't intervene, he didn't smile. He simply observed, as if calculating every reaction around him. His wife, on the other hand, seemed to relish the spectacle, leaning over to whisper with her friends, fueling the collective laughter even more. To the maid, those seconds seemed eternal. The entire room watched her, as if she were a character created to entertain the elite. But no one imagined that hidden beneath that simple uniform was something that would forever change the way they viewed her. And fate, with its peculiar sense of justice, was already beginning to prepare the moment when laughter would turn into silence and disbelief. The laughter echoed through the room with cruel force. Each time the maid passed by with her tray, a new malicious comment arose, as if her presence had become the main attraction of the evening. The guests, lulled by expensive wine and a false sense of superiority, used her as a target to feed their pride. "Bring her to serve at the main tables," a man in a suit quipped, drawing knowing laughter. "Be careful you don't knock it over again," said a woman in a sparkling blue dress, laughing loudly. The young blonde pressed her lips together, trying not to let the tears fall. Her face was already flushed, and her heart was beating fast, as if it were about to explode. She clutched the tray so tightly that her knuckles were white. She felt trapped in a stage of humiliation with no way out. But fate silently was beginning to prepare the twist. As she bent down to pick up another napkin, a small pendant slipped from the neckline of her uniform. The object gleamed for a moment in the chandeliers, catching the attention of a few watchful eyes. It was a discreet piece of jewelry, but it bore an unmistakable symbol, an ancient coat of arms, belonging to a powerful family that many of those present knew only from stories. An elderly man sitting near the central table widened his eyes as he recognized the detail. "Impossible," he murmured, his voice trembling, nearly dropping his glass. His wife, noticing, leaned over and whispered, "Did you see what I saw?" The murmur began to spread. At first low, almost imperceptible, but soon it grew louder, drowning out some of the laughter. People leaned in to get a better look, trying to confirm it with their own eyes. "Is it what I think?" they murmured to each other. The maid, oblivious to what had happened, adjusted the pendant against her chest and continued her task, still embarrassed, not realizing that the attention that had previously been merely mockery was now turning into curiosity. The millionaire host, seated in a prominent position, also noticed. His eyes, always cold and calculating, narrowed as they fixed on the symbol on the pendant. It was as if he had recognized something he preferred to keep hidden. He slowly raised the glass to his lips, but his hand trembled. The laughter began to subside. Some guests fell silent, others exchanged nervous glances. The atmosphere in the room gradually shifted. What had once been pure amusement at the young woman's expense now became a suffocating mystery, and, without realizing it, the maid held within herself the key to a revelation that would transform that night into an unforgettable scandal. The atmosphere in the room was no longer the same. The collective laughter that had dominated the room began to fade, replaced by discreet whispers and curious glances. There were still those who tried to maintain the mockery, but the power of the humiliation was no longer as potent. Something had changed, and everyone felt it. The young waitress still walked between the tables with her tray in her hands, her face flushed, her eyes teary. For her, nothing had changed. She still believed she was just the target of laughter. She still felt the shame burning her soul. But among the guests, the atmosphere grew denser, as if a secret were about to emerge. The elderly man who had recognized the pendant couldn't take his eyes off her. His wife, visibly nervous, whispered in the ears of other women, and soon the rumor began to grow. "Have you seen the necklace? Do you recognize the coat of arms?" Some widened their eyes, others frowned, trying to remember where they'd seen that symbol. A word began to circulate discreetly: heritage. Another, even more loaded, went around the tables: blood. The millionaire host's wife, realizing that the audience's attention was no longer under her control, decided to take action. Suddenly she rose from her chair and called out loudly, "Servant, come here immediately!" The hall fell silent. The young woman paused, hesitant, but obeyed. She approached the central table where her wealthy wife waited for her with her chin held high and her eyes sparkling with arrogance. "Show me what you're wearing around your neck," he ordered, pointing his finger at the pendant. The maid's heart raced. She put her hand to her chest, as if instinctively trying to hide the necklace. "It's just a memory," he murmured in a trembling voice. The wife laughed mockingly. "Remember," she repeated, loud enough for everyone to hear. "So that's why you think you're different. Do you think this cheap ornament makes you more than a servant?" Some guests laughed, but the sound was no longer strong. The curious murmur grew louder. The audience's eyes were fixed on the pendant, not on the wife's mockery. It was then that the millionaire host intervened. Until that moment he had remained silent, simply observing. But upon realizing that the symbol could become everyone's topic, his expression hardened. "That's enough," he said in a deep voice. "Don't waste your time on nonsense." But the effect was the opposite. His silence felt like confirmation. Those with attentive eyes noticed the nervousness in his posture, the sweat on his forehead, the way he avoided looking directly at the pendant. The frightened maid remained motionless. The words she'd been holding in her throat for years burned, wanting to come out, but she still lacked the courage. Meanwhile, the hall was buzzing with whispers. The humiliation she'd suffered minutes before now transformed into a collective curiosity no one could contain. And in that moment, everyone knew there was something about that young woman that the money and power of those people could not erase. The room felt like a stage where tension was the new spectacle. The laughter no longer held the same force. In its place were nervous whispers, fixed gazes, and an air of anticipation. What had once been collective amusement now turned to suspicion. The millionaire host's wife, accustomed to controlling every detail of the party, realized something was slipping from her grasp. The coat of arms on the maid's pendant had awakened an uneasiness she couldn't suppress. She approached the young woman again, her hand raised in an authoritative gesture. "Show me this properly," he ordered, his voice echoing through the hall. The blonde, her hands trembling, tried to hide the necklace. Her heart pounded like a drum inside her chest. She didn't want to expose that secret. Not there, not like that. But the eyes were pressing, each guest leaning toward her, as if they were all waiting for a mystery to be revealed. A businessman seated near the central table stood up. His voice, charged with authority, echoed, "This coat of arms isn't just any coat of arms. I recognize it from afar. It belongs to an old respected family, and it carries weight in this city." The room erupted in murmurs. Some stood up to get a better look, others moved closer, pushing chairs aside. The maid felt her knees weaken, but remained standing, even with tears in her eyes. The millionaire, silent until then, realized he could no longer remain silent. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and stood up. "Enough speculation," he said gravely, trying to regain control. "It's just an old jewel, nothing more." But his voice sounded fragile, lacking the strength of old. The guests looked at each other, and some smiled in disbelief. The mere fact that he needed to justify himself was proof that there was something more to it. The wife, noticing her husband's nervousness, took a step forward and pointed her finger at the maid. "Then you speak," he shouted. "Tell me where you got this from." The young woman clutched the pendant to her chest. Her tear-filled eyes met the millionaire's for a moment, and in that gaze she saw fear. It wasn't just anger or disdain. It was fear, and that said so much more than words. The room, now in absolute silence, seemed to hold its breath. The guests, who minutes before had laughed at her embarrassment, now waited anxiously. Humiliation had given way to curiosity, and with each passing second, the certainty grew. That maid was hiding something capable of changing the course of that evening, and perhaps of everyone. There. The room was thick, as if the air had become too dense to breathe. The cruel laughter that had once dominated the party had completely disappeared. What remained now was silence and restless murmurs. Everyone's focus was no longer on the young woman's humiliation, but on what the pendant she carried might mean. The millionaire's wife, visibly uncomfortable, insisted. "Speak!" he shouted, his eyes flashing. "Where did you get that necklace? Who gave it to you?" The maid, trembling, clutched the pendant to her chest as if it were her only defense. Tears streamed down her face, but there was also a flame in her eyes, something beginning to blossom deep within her grief. She still didn't have the courage to say it, but the silence screamed louder than any words. The guests no longer accepted evasive answers. An elderly gentleman, known for his influential position, rose from the table and declared, "I know that symbol. There's no doubt about it. It belongs to the Aarons family, and everyone here knows what that name means." The murmur exploded like wildfire. Some covered their mouths in astonishment, others leaned forward to get a better look, and many began to question aloud. "Is it possible? That explains a lot." But how could she have something like that? The millionaire host, realizing he was about to lose control, stood up abruptly. His face was red, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Enough nonsense," he roared, trying to silence the crowd. "It's just a coincidence, a cheap piece, nothing more." But his voice no longer had the same effect as before. His desperate tone betrayed his nervousness. The guests looked at each other, increasingly doubting his words. Even his wife, who used to repeat and amplify everything he said, now eyed him suspiciously. The maid, still silent, felt her heart beat faster. The weight of the collective gaze crushed her, but also gave her strength. For the first time, it wasn't just her against everyone. It was her against the lie. An elegant lady, the kind who rarely spoke, raised her voice. "If it's not true, then why do you look so nervous?" The room fell silent. The question hung in the air like a sure blow. The millionaire stammered, trying to find an answer, but nothing came. With each passing second, the weight of the truth seemed closer to breaking. The wife, restless, took another step forward, facing the young woman. "Who are you?" he asked in a low yet tense voice. The maid slowly raised her eyes. There were tears, there was fear, but there was also dignity. The entire room waited, every gaze fixed on her. And it was at that moment that everyone understood. The revelation could no longer be postponed. The entire room was torn between discomfort and anticipation. The laughter had ceased, replaced by tense glances and increasingly loud whispers. The collective humiliation was no longer funny. Now everyone was facing something bigger, something that could turn the night into a scandal. The millionaire's wife, accustomed to being the boss of the show, couldn't bear to see eyes lingering on the maid's pendant. Her voice, laced with venom, echoed again. "Are you trying to fool everyone? That necklace is nothing more than cheap trinkets. Show the truth and put an end to this charade." The young maid was breathing heavily, her sweaty hands clutching the pendant to her chest. She didn't want to expose anything, but the pressure was unbearable. The room felt like an arena, and she was the center of a silent trial. The millionaire host realized the risk. He stood up quickly, raising his voice like never before. "Enough," he said, trying to sound firm. "You're turning nonsense into a spectacle. This girl is just an employee, nothing more." But his attempt to close the subject sounded desperate. Some guests frowned, others began to whisper even more. His nervousness only reinforced the suspicion that something was going on. A well-known diplomat, a respected figure, raised his voice. "If it was just an employee, why are you so bothered?" The question fell like a bombshell in the room. The millionaire paled, and his wife looked at him with a mixture of surprise and fury. The murmur grew like waves, filling every corner of the room. The maid, silent, let a tear run down her face. Her blue eyes met the millionaire's for a moment, and there was something more than fear there. There was recognition. The kind of look that can't be sustained when there's no connection. The public began to demand explanations. "Who is she anyway?" a woman said loudly. "Why do you carry a coat of arms of that family?" asked another. The cornered millionaire didn't respond. He just clenched his fists and looked away. Every second of his silence was more devastating than any confession. The enraged wife turned on the maid, but her voice no longer held any power. The arrogance that had once intimidated her now seemed pathetic before the weight of the truth about to emerge. The young woman took a deep breath, her chest heaving. She hadn't said anything yet, but everyone in the hall already knew she wasn't just a maid. The blood coursing through her veins told a story no one there could ignore, and the revelation, inevitable, was already beginning to take shape. The hall felt like a volcano about to erupt. The tension in the air was no longer curiosity, it was necessity. Every guest wanted answers, every gaze fixed on the young maid clutching the pendant to her chest. The cruel laughter had died. Now only a heavy silence remained, punctuated by nervous whispers. The millionaire's wife, enraged at losing the scene she controlled, decided to strike back. "Are you really believing this?" he shouted, pointing his finger at the maid. "She's nothing but a fraud. That necklace must be stolen. It's just an excuse to get attention." The hall reacted with louder murmurs. Some widened their eyes, others frowned in disapproval. One of the most respected guests, a retired judge, raised his voice sternly. Be careful with your words. Accusing without proof is as shameful as humiliating." His wife blushed but didn't back down. She advanced on the maid, trying to snatch the pendant from her neck. The young woman instinctively took a step back, but it was the millionaire host who suddenly stood up, firmly grasping his wife's arm. "Enough!" His voice echoed through the hall. The impact was devastating. Everyone fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. The man who had always remained silent, enduring his wife's arrogance, now interrupted her in front of everyone. "Don't you realize that every word you say makes her even greater?" he said, staring at her firmly. "It's not she who's making herself ridiculous. It's you." The wife, unable to believe what she was hearing, tried to free herself, but her hand was shaking. "Are you going to disown me? Here? In front of everyone?" The millionaire took a deep breath and turned to his guests. "You all understand. This pendant isn't in the wrong hands, it's exactly where it belongs." A heavy silence fell over the room. The maid, tears streaming, slowly raised her face. Her eyes met the millionaire's, and in that moment, without a word, he confirmed what many already suspected. She wasn't just an employee. She was someone with a legitimate claim to that coat of arms. The guests began to murmur in shock. Some clapped their hands over their mouths. Others shook their heads, trying to process the revelation. The wife stepped back, her eyes brimming with anger and shame, realizing that for the first time her voice no longer held power. And in that instant, the entire room understood. The truth could no longer be hidden. The hall was in an uproar. The rumor of the coat of arms had spread like wildfire, and the tension grew with each passing minute. The cruel laughter had completely vanished. Now only the weight of curiosity and the fear of the truth remained. The maid, still trembling, held the pendant to her chest, while dozens of eyes pierced her in silence. The millionaire host desperately tried to maintain control. "I told you it's nothing," he shouted, his voice louder than usual, but with a tone that sounded more like a plea than authority. "Just some necklace. You're turning a trivial matter into a scandal." But the more he spoke, the more suspicious the guests became. His hands trembled and sweat ran down his forehead. Even the waiters, motionless in the corner, watched with attentive eyes. It was as if the entire room had transformed into a courtroom, and the millionaire was in the dock. The wife, still overcome with rage, could not resist. "Then explain," she said, glaring at him furiously. "If it's so insignificant, why are you so upset?" The question dropped like a stone in the middle of the room. Murmurs erupted among the guests. Some were already whispering, "He knew. He's hiding something. That explains so much." The maid, in tears, finally looked up. Her voice was shaky but clear enough to echo. "I never asked to be here. I never asked to carry this name. But I won't allow them to continue humiliating me as if I were nothing." The room froze. Each of her words seemed to weigh tons. The millionaire's eyes widened and his heart raced. The shocked guests fell silent, waiting for what would happen next. She took a deep breath and added, "The blood that runs through my veins is the same that you revere." The impact was immediate. Some guests rose from their chairs, others covered their mouths in shock. His wife clutched her chest, unable to believe it. And the pale-faced millionaire finally made the gesture everyone was waiting for. He lowered his head. There was no denying it anymore. The salon, once a stage of humiliation for the young woman, now became an arena of revelation. And in that instant, everyone knew. The maid wasn't just an invisible employee. She was someone who carried a truth capable of changing everything. The room was completely silent, as if even the air had stopped circulating. The maid's revelation still echoed in everyone's ears. "The blood that runs through my veins is the same that you revere." The words hung like an invisible sentence, laden with truth and pain. The millionaire host, until then the absolute master of the party, seemed reduced to a small, powerless man. His bowed head, hunched shoulders, and the sweat dripping down his forehead betrayed more than any words. He had known all along. He had guarded for that secret like a shield, but now in front of everyone there was no hiding it anymore. The shocked guests murmured among themselves, Some recoiled in shame after laughing just minutes earlier, while others watched the young woman with a mixture of respect and regret. The wife, still in disbelief, tried to find the strength to assert herself, but her voice faltered as she opened her mouth. Her finger, which had previously been pointing like a gun, now trembled aimlessly in the air. The maid, standing in the center of the room, no longer trembled. Tears still flowed, but they were no longer of humiliation, they were of liberation. For the first time, she didn't shrink from the stares. On the contrary, she held them steady. The millionaire tried to speak, but his voice was choked. I just wanted to protect. But he was interrupted by the elderly diplomat who had earlier recognized the coat of arms. Protect? His voice echoed firmly. You didn't protect her. You allowed her to be humiliated in front of everyone, even though you know who she is. The impact was devastating. His wife clapped her hand over her mouth, and some guests nodded in agreement. The millionaire sat back down at the table, defeated. The young woman took a deep breath and took a step forward. Her voice sounded clear and firm. Today you laughed at me. You pointed, you mocked, you treated me as if I were invisible. But remember this. When the truth comes out, it always changes everything. A heavy silence fell for a few seconds until, slowly, some began to applaud. At first timidly, then louder, until the entire hall echoed with applause. It wasn't applause just for her, but for the truth that had finally come to light. Unable to bear it, his wife left the room in a hurry, her heels clicking against the marble like a lament. The millionaire remained motionless, defeated, unable to raise his eyes, and the waitress, now revealed, walked slowly to the front door. Each step was accompanied by glances that no longer despised her but recognized her. She left without looking back, knowing the humiliation was no longer hers. It belonged to everyone who judged her. That night, the gala dinner that was supposed to celebrate power and status went down in history as the moment when a simple maid showed that the truth has the power to bend even the most arrogant. If this story kept you hooked until the end, leave a like and subscribe for more stories like this.